Good morning, everyone. I am Colleen Van Lent. I'm a white, cisgendered female with light brown hair that goes to my shoulders. I'm wearing a black and gray shirt, and like many of you, casual pants and tennis shoes that no one can see on screen. My Zoom background is the North Quad building that is home to the School of Information where I am a lecturer for. I would like to personally welcome you to this year's conference, Toward an Anti-Ableist Academy, Advancing Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility at U of M. Throughout the month of October, this conference includes 11 online sessions as part of Disability Community Month activities. These 11 sessions focus on the progress made and the work still to be done on recommendations to close accessibility gaps across campus for disabled students, faculty, and staff at U of M. I was asked to do the introduction this morning because of my participation in the Student Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Board. The IDEA Board was created to assess the university's current structures and culture as they relate to students with disabilities, identify areas for improvement, and provide recommendations to enhance the lived experience of disabled students. As a member of the IDEA Board, I worked with fellow colleagues on digital accessibility. We had the opportunity to make recommendations on new training, new policies, and procedures. If you would like to learn more about the IDEA Board, we are adding a link to the chat. Volunteering to be on a university-wide committee is not only an important way to improve our committee, but it's also a great way to meet other university members, such as the ones you will hear from today. On that note, I am pleased to welcome you to Dismantling Ableism Across Academic Spaces and Hierarchies, presented by an incredible group of panelists. We will begin with Dr. Robin Queen, Professor of Linguistics, English Language and Literatures, and Germanic Languages and Literatures in the College of SNA. Robin, I'll leave it to you.
Thanks, Colleen. My name is Robin Queen. I am a queer cisgender white woman. I have medium length brownish hair with a lot of gray in it. I am sitting in a room where the background is a dark red wall with a black and white painting on it. I'm wearing a light blue cardigan with a white shirt underneath. When I began as a department chair, I had a strong commitment to accessibility and inclusivity, but only the vaguest understanding of the pieces necessary for a department to actually be accessible and inclusive. Over time, I began to learn how commitment and the actual work of creating accessible and inclusive spaces were two very different orientations, and that the actual work was a lot messier, imperfect, and sometimes totally triumphant than the commitment. While I was chair, I also had a severe flare of a chronic health condition. So I saw some of the issues related to accessibility and accommodation from both an administrator's perspective and from the perspective of someone needing accommodation. And that simultaneous perspective is what I bring to you today. I'll be honest in saying that the personal perspective has made aspects of preparing for these few minutes that I'll be speaking with you deeply uncomfortable. And I actually almost backed out because of the discomfort. But then I realized that my personal experience, maybe more so than my administrative one, is a reverberating echo of what so many in and outside our communities experience frequently, sometimes daily. And that's what makes the commitment to an anti-ableist academy call forth the messy and far less perfect set of actions that are the only way to actually create and sustain an anti-ableist academy. So on a personal note, I'll say once my doctors and I understood what Work Connections, which is the unit that assesses accommodation needs or restriction needs, what they actually needed, what information they needed, I have had a relatively good experience with accommodations when I needed them. However, there are a couple places where I think there's more work to be done. So first is the nature of academic work, as many of you know, is highly variable. which makes the range of accommodations necessary also quite variable. In my particular case, the approved accommodations proved impossible to truly use because it was up to me to enforce them. So one example I had was a restriction that involved time, limiting the amount of time I could work in a week and in a single day. I was given a course release as an accommodation to that, but it was up to me to make that time restriction work, and it honestly proved impossible. Impossible enough that I ended up taking multiple medical leaves at different points. The other thing that's a little bit tricky for individuals is that merit and promotion reviews are rarely, if ever, considered as an accommodation or in need of accommodation. And over time, this can easily lead to salary compression and the lack of access to a range of professional opportunities for those with disabilities or illnesses. Now, review criteria is one of the places where my administrative and personal perspectives overlapped. And while I didn't work out a way to successfully accommodate those, there are some actions that I took that I think made a difference. So the first thing I tried to do was work very much on the principle of universal design. And while that's not always attainable, you can always poke and prod and figure out what is attainable. You need to consider issues that might arise for people with mobility concerns, visual issues, neurodiversity, and hearing ability. And there are a few others, but those are the most common in the spaces you may be using. You need to know where bathrooms are located and if there are single-use bathrooms anywhere nearby. And you need to provide as much information as you can when you advertise, say, an event about what people can assume will be there and how they can let you know if they need something else. The second thing I think that you have to do, particularly as an administrator, as a department chair, is you have to assume that your department bears the responsibility for arranging and paying for services, particularly those associated with one-off events. You should not expect individual faculty to use their research time or their research funds to do the work of providing services. The way that I made that work was I worked very closely with my chief administrator to figure out how to provide services and how to budget for them at the beginning of each academic year. Now, there are also some issues that arise that are more, I would say, systemic and in need of more concentrated attention. The first one is, and many of you have heard over the last several weeks, issues about the unit work connections. And again, I had relatively good experiences with work connections on multiple occasions. However, they are not well equipped to make recommendations for academics or for faculty. The kinds of forms you have to fill out and the nature of how they work is much more oriented towards people who work set hours in a consistent schedule and who have a supervisor who can manage the workflow. Work connections is not well suited to accommodate chronic illness that may need accommodation at times, but not necessarily all the time. And they are not well placed for helping with people with disabilities. A second issue is there is no clear central position or guidance on these matters. Although there are some pilots, and I think Dean Stern will talk a little bit about those at the end. It is often very unclear which offices and which people in those offices need to be involved, what kinds of accommodations are and aren't available, and who in your department will do any additional labor associated with, say, universal accessibility or individual accommodations. What we did was make sure we had dedicated staff who had, as part of their work duties, the tasks of meeting accessibility needs. So if it was copies that needed to be made or slides that needed to be offered early, we had staff members who were dedicated to that or had that as their work duty. But I will say, I mean, with lean staffs, it's sometimes hard to figure out how to distribute this work in an equitable way that is also certain to provide what people need. And the final issue, and I would say this is probably especially relevant to people who have disabilities and need various accommodations on a regular basis, is the cost and who pays for it. It is never clear, and I got shunted many times from office to office and school to provost, trying to find how to pay for some of the needs. Now, I think things are slowly changing, but it is true that no one seems to have a clear responsibility for providing the funding for accommodation and accessibility. In my department, our most frequent need was for CART and sign interpretation, and we were able to cover those costs. But it was primarily because they usually arose for guests coming in to present to the department or a specific class, in other words, one-off events. It would have been much more challenging if we had a colleague who needed those services daily and needed them not only at the University of Michigan, but also at professional conferences and other professional events that occurred in other places. So these are just some of the things that I think any administrator needs to think about. And if you're someone who needs these accommodations, it's also useful to think about them for yourself so that you're prepared for what you may need to do and how you may need to talk to different people. And with that, I will turn the virtual mic over to my colleague, Tessa Tinkle, who will speak on her experiences.
I'm Tessa Tinkle. I'm a white cisgender woman with short silver hair, blue frame glasses, and I'm sitting in front of a dark green office wall. I interpreted my brief for this talk as that of a teacher because I'm a teacher at heart. And so I'm going to talk about neurodiversity and my experiences of the challenges that those of us who identify as neurodiverse have, and some ideas about how we as a university might move toward greater inclusion and value for neurodiverse people. So as a humanist, I think of neurodiversity, mental illness, and madness as an essential part of the human condition and as an important subject of scholarship and teaching. Neurodiversity is normal and common. 1 in 5 US adults experience mental illness each year. 50% of all lifetime mental illness begins by age 14 and 75% by age 24. College students, staff, and faculty are often in the process of learning about their own, their peers, their families, and their friends' illnesses. And we do not typically have a robust intellectual framework for understanding neurodiversity or developing a positive disability identity. On the other hand, university faculty are well positioned to develop such frameworks. A significant number of faculty are treated for mental illnesses, myself included, and might benefit from studying and teaching the subject in whatever way our disciplinary training suggests to us. The path to accommodations for mental illness is ironically ableist. To receive accommodation, a person with a mental illness must first recognize the symptoms as illness, as opposed to reality. When symptoms occur early in life, they can be experienced just as part of the way the world is, as one's identity. When they begin later, they can feel like a disruption of identity. If you recognize your symptoms as symptoms, you can try to seek a reliable psychiatric diagnosis. I would emphasize reliable because misdiagnosis and mistreatment are common. Social inequities in mental health care begin here. Psychiatric and psychotherapeutic care is expensive and hard to find in a lot of the country. If you can get a diagnosis, that can lead to medications or other treatments. Medications aren't a cure. They only help manage symptoms. Medications are also not a quick fix. Finding the right medication or combination of medications is often a years-long project. Finally, the adjustment to medicated cognition can be a significant disruption of what we experience as normal. If a student gets a diagnosis, they can ask services for students with disabilities for accommodations. Staff and faculty have no comparable service, but there's some research on what our accommodations might look like, and Alex will talk about initiatives for staff and faculty. Each step in obtaining treatment is a potential barrier, and many of our students, staff, and faculty do not have access to adequate mental health care. A lot of social groups do not accept mental illness as a real thing. We may be told to pray about it or that we're just seeking attention. For those who can access it, the psychiatric pharmaceutical approach may and often does offer substantial relief from symptoms, but it's a long and unpredictable road, and we may at any or every point in our careers be at an early stage in learning to live with madness. Given the reality of mental health care in the US, I believe we need to think beyond accommodations, which are available to very few people. I'd like to propose that we design courses and syllabuses that create fewer barriers for neurodiverse students. I'd also like to see us think about the ways we can use our positions within the university to create an anti-ableist curriculum. We might begin by recognizing and valuing the points of view, contributions, authority, and agency of mad people. As a scholar of literature, I'm aware that people with mental illnesses make important contributions to the genre of life writing. I teach a course called Pedagogies of the Mad with a reading list of memoirs by mad folks. My students and I learn a lot from analyzing how other people experience and think about their mental illnesses. This kind of course enables neurodiverse students to create a real and virtual disability community, which is important to managing a mental illness and forming a positive disability identity, which I would define as experiencing solidarity with a disability community, recognizing one's value, and accepting the disadvantages that can come with mental illness. In this course, my students' experiences of madness become valuable academic resources. We might also treat mental illness as a socially urgent topic for academic inquiry. America is in the middle of a mental health crisis, and a lot of research and education are needed to address and remedy severe social injustices. Given this context, a course in, for example, the history of mental illness would help students understand how and why we came to have the system we do and what we might do to improve the situation. Such a course should include the voices of neurodiverse writers so that we are included in discussions about us. We might also teach in a way that critically examines prejudice and discrimination. For example, a class might analyze visual or media representations of madness and what they reveal about social stereotypes. Again, you could juxtapose media representations of what mad folks say about their experiences. From my point of view, the university is a perfect site for developing forward-looking anti-ableist educational policies and programs. We can contribute to a better future by using our curriculum and our positions to disrupt stereotypes and stigma about mental health. We can finally use our positions to advance understanding of and create new knowledge about neurodiversity, and we can bring students and colleagues at all levels into this very important social justice work. I'm going to pass the virtual mic now to David Porter.
My name is David Porter. I'm a professor of English and comparative literature here at the university. I'm a white cisgendered male with a whole lot more gray hair than I had 5 years ago. I'm sitting in front of a folding screen in my living room. I'm wearing a dark green button-up shirt, and I'm feeling very grateful for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. I'm speaking from the perspective of a past department chair for an audience, which I'm assuming includes some colleagues, some folks who might find themselves in a position either now or in the future to contribute to ongoing efforts to shift institutional culture in ways suggested by our previous speakers. My aim here is simply to share a few brief practical pointers based on my own experience as a department chair that may well seem obvious to some folks in the audience, but in my experience have not always been obvious to faculty and staff, including myself, who find themselves in department leadership roles and have not themselves had personal experiences with requesting accommodations for themselves. The challenge here, it seems to me, in promoting inclusive practices in our departments is typical of the challenge of promoting institutional change more generally here at Michigan, which means that the focus really has to be not simply on policy changes or structural changes, but also broader paradigm shifts within the institutional culture as a whole. In this case, in our department, I became aware of the need of a paradigm shift away from a purely legalistic understanding of accommodation requirements with respect to the ADA, which I think is the perspective that many of us inhabited as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, towards a perspective that focuses instead on creating a fully welcoming space within a department that will enable every member of that department to make their very best contributions. Achieving such a paradigm shift, of course, involves not only reducing practical barriers to full participation, which there are many, as we've been learning, but also crucially to reducing the burdens in time and labor on people who need accommodations. And this is something that I think was a very important lesson it learned in our department in recent years. We've come to recognize that the very act of requesting accommodations is a significant burden on those who need to do so on a regular basis. This comes with it an additional emotional, psychological burden of making personal disclosures to whether it's department leadership or work connections or other administrators, that could be extraordinarily draining and emotionally costly as well. And finally, there's the third, often invisible and certainly uncompensated burden of advocacy, of taking on the burden of fostering institutional change. So I guess the lesson is that it's essential for department leadership to recognize those burdens and to do everything possible to alleviate them for the sake of equity and promoting full participation. I want to offer briefly 3 specific recommendations for advancing this kind of paradigm shift within departments and units generally. The first specific recommendation is to be proactive about gathering information within a unit about existing needs and priorities that, again, members of the leadership team might not be fully aware of. The leadership, of course, cannot address needs that it doesn't know about. And it's essential to recognize the responsibility for learning about these needs falls squarely on unit leadership to educate themselves about currently unmet needs. This means doing things like soliciting accessibility requests on all event announcements, not just some of them, but all of them, just making that a matter of common practice. And then most importantly, taking the time to listen to various constituencies within a department, seeking out faculty and students who might be in a position to educate leadership about what the unmet needs are, to make sure that there's a full recognition of what can and should be done. The second recommendation is to be proactive in providing accommodations and anticipating needs. So specifically in our departments, some of the most salient recent changes over the past several years have been a practice of miking all in-person events. So anticipating that there will likely be people who will benefit from having amplified sound. requesting accessibility handouts from all visiting speakers, right? So without differentiating between events where we expect or don't expect particular people to attend, we require all of our visiting speakers to provide handouts now to make sure captioning is available for all virtual events, of course. And then, of course, making sure that all in-person department events, especially off campus, are fully accessible. And that the third specific recommendation has to do with advocacy. And this, again, was something that I think our leadership team learned through practical experience over the past several years. And this comes out of, again, a recognition that there's a significant burden on those who are regularly requesting accommodations, not only to attend to their own needs, but to move the institution forward. So it really does, it is imperative for responsible departmental leadership teams to take on that advocacy burden themselves, and to make sure that deans and the provost office are fully aware of both local needs and structural deficiencies within the shape of the institution as a whole. It really is important, I think, for leaders at all levels to learn about best practices at peer institutions and advocate for structural changes of a kind that will bring our institution up to the level of best practices that can be found elsewhere. With that, I will wrap up and hand the mic over to Alex.
Thank you, David. My name is Alex Stern. I'm the Associate Dean for Humanities. And I see Robin on the screen. Hi, Robin. I'm Alexandra Stern, she, her pronouns. Oh, there we are. So hello again. I'm Alexandra Stern. I'm a cisgendered queer white woman with dark rimmed glasses, brownish hair, and I'm wearing a black blazer. I'm in my office at home and the background is blurred because I have many pets that keep coming in and out, and I'm trying to keep them from disrupting my presentation. I'm really pleased to be with all of you here this morning. And I think it's a very positive and productive sign that we're having this conversation. We are all in this together. This work is collective. And this is just one facet of a larger collective across campus that is moving disability access and inclusion forward. I am going to make three rather brief points, just almost shorthanded points, which would require more time to discuss in full, but so you get a flavor of what I would like to focus on. So the first is that I definitely identify as a strong disability ally. In fact, the first job I ever had was when I grew up in Berkeley, California. And the Center for Independent Living started there, you may be aware. And the first job I had as a teenager was as a personal assistant to people with disabilities. For the most part, people using wheelchairs and motorized devices. And it really made a large impact on me, and I think has continued to play a role in the way I understand the world and the way I understand community. Somewhat related to that, later in life, I developed an interest and have spent much of my career studying the history of eugenics, which is a history of destructive and insidious ableism, which relates to often harming people with disabilities and or with perceived disabilities as a kind of large labeling system of difference that impacted people and their bodies and their minds, their body minds. And I'm very aware of the power of labels to harm and the importance of words. And that leads into my second point, and I'm going to put something for everyone into the chat. which is that words matter, language is important, how we refer to one another, how we refer to ourselves. I do believe that raising awareness around disability inclusion requires much greater attention to language and how language can harm and how language can include. That relates to my third point, which is about building disability access and inclusion at University of Michigan. Again, I'd like to underscore this is a collective project of which we are all part. And one of the most exciting and gratifying aspects of my work and involvement in the university over the past several years has been growing momentum around disability inclusion and access. I have met people from across campus, from across schools and colleges who are committed to this work, who are committed to thinking about topics that have been covered today by my colleagues, friends, and our panelists, such as thinking about neurodiversity among our faculty and staff and among our students as well. I think I did mention that I'm the Associate Dean for Humanities in the College of Literature, Science, and Arts. And in that capacity, I have been working with others to move forward a pilot to provide more access and inclusion in the College of LSA. We're rolling this pilot out here because this is where we're based, and we're fortunate to have a Dean Ann Curzan, who is enormously supportive of this project and thus is putting the resources behind it. We hope that this project can serve as a model for expanding disability access and inclusion across what we all know is an exceedingly decentralized university. What this pilot consists of are really three components. The first is we are in the process of hiring 2 disability navigators, coordinators, specialists. We haven't quite landed on the name. In fact, it's an iterative process, and we're going to determine what title makes the most sense for these 2 specialists that we are going to hire, who will assist with disability accommodations and access for faculty and staff. These roles are not student-facing because that is handled when the Students with Disabilities Center. Of course, everyone will work together and coordinate. So the pilot includes hiring 2 individuals who will be brought on to the LSA professional staff and work with our newly hired and wonderful people person, Carla Williams, as well as the HR team and others who are part of this effort. A second component is, and I think this relates to what David and a few others have said, events in LSA and sponsored by LSA, including departments, working to make events that we host, both in person and virtually, as accessible as possible, and offering resources to do that. This is really building from where there was nothing, or not nothing, but not much to begin with. Scattered examples, scattered points of light, and scattered kind of points where things had fallen through the cracks. We're trying to build a solid foundation with both the coordinators and thinking about events and changing the culture around events. Finally, the last component of this has run through the previous aspects I've discussed, and that is disability inclusion. For example, we will work with the newly hired navigators to take a long, hard, deep, critical look at the language around disability, at the representations or invisibility. Like many marginalized groups, people with disabilities are often hypervisible or invisible. we will address that in thinking about the language and thinking about the representation, and in working towards a much more inclusive approach that lifts all up and is not about us versus them, but is about a broader tent of us. So with that, I will stop. And I think I now pass it to my colleague Remy, who will close out the session and facilitate some Q&A. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Alex. This is Remy Yurgo speaking. I'm an associate professor in digital studies and English. I am going to offer some brief remarks and then help to moderate discussion. I am a white non-binary person. I am sitting in my office in Angel Hall, and there is a red backpack behind me, as well as an electric light orchestra clock. I am wearing orange-ish glasses, as well as a lavender shirt and black cardigan. I'd like to thank the panelists for being so forthright and also forward-looking in their thinking about accessibility and anti-ableism movements on campus. I want to highlight some of the things that Robin and Tessa noted in particular about thinking about universal design, centering the experiences of people with disabilities, thinking about the ways in which neurodivergence and madness and chronic illness are not configured through the services that are existing at U of M. I'd also like to thank David and Alex for turning our attention to thinking about departmental modes of action as well as institutional modes of action for the broader project of institutional change. What I'm going to do very briefly is share some personal experiences and then turn back to the conversations that all four panelists were describing in terms of action-oriented items and the challenges that we face at a radically decentralized institution. So when I first started at U of M, I had a very difficult time figuring out who I go to for accommodations. I went to the ADA coordinator at the time, who described the interactive process as it exists at U of M, and that my next step would be to go to my department chair and to discuss my accommodation needs and to provide documentation, which my chair would supposedly keep in a locked filing cabinet. And I remember thinking at the time that the locked filing cabinet wasn't the issue. The issue was being an untenured faculty member who has a variety of mental disabilities, including autism, and knowing full well how my needs might be received by colleagues and leadership. At that point, I went to SSD, Services for Students with Disabilities, and I talked with the then director about the kinds of accommodations I had received as a graduate student. And he told me he was very worried that if I made those requests, it would negatively impact my tenure case. So at that point, I existed in limbo for a number of years, not receiving the accommodations I needed. When I tried to broach conversations with mentors who were very well-meaning and trying to help, they had no knowledge of how the systems worked at U of M, nor did they have the personal experience of disability that would give them that kind of insider knowledge. And I was repeatedly told some version of, this is the job, or manage your time better. Unhelpful adages that ultimately created a climate that felt very hostile. After I became tenured, this has sort of become a mission on my part, because those who are most precarious at our institution are the ones who are getting caught in this trap the most. I'm thinking especially about student employees, including graduate student instructors, lecturers, postdocs, and untenured faculty more broadly. As others on the panel have noted, because we have a decentralized system and no faculty or staff equivalent of SSC, what results are departments essentially, or units essentially, being on the hook for the costs of accommodations. There is no central accommodation fund at University of Michigan, which is out of keeping with our peer institutions. I have been part of conversations that involved trying to figure out where funds would come for my own accommodations. This has happened for other colleagues I know as well, which puts department leadership in very precarious positions. As Alex is noting, LSA is doing a lot in terms of leadership for trying to redress some of these inequities, because as one might know, if your unit or direct supervisors know the costs of your accommodations, however unconsciously, this is a recipe for bias and for discrimination and can negatively impact merit, promotion, and review. So Alex's notes about the pilot project from LSA, the desire to create more centralized resources for event programming are very important goals. The other note that I want to make in terms of how structurally things work at U of M is to call attention to a 2019 topical report from AHEAD, which is the Association of Higher Education and Disability, on ADA coordination at other institutions. And I believe that Audie might be able to drop a link to the AHEAD website into the chat. I will note it is unfortunately behind a paywall, but I'm happy to share my copy if anybody would like to reach out. What's really important to highlight here, in that report of institutions who responded to AHEAD's survey, other doctoral institutions, 85% reported a centralized approach to employee accommodations, meaning a main office that employees could go to for this process. Those who report a decentralized approach occupied 3% of the survey respondents, and U of M arguably would fall within that 3%, which is not a good 3% to fall within. So as we're thinking about all of these questions, where I think it might be worthwhile to turn our conversation, is to think how this accommodation framework at U of M routinely fails its most vulnerable community members, to think about what our co-panelists have been saying about moving beyond a compliance-based framework, even moving beyond an accommodations-based framework, and thinking toward universal design frameworks and anti-ableism frameworks in our next steps and actions. So thank you, and I believe we should now turn to discussion and conversation. And Dilip has posted a question that came up in the chat that might be a good place to start for our panelists. And that question is, what is the biggest struggle you have all seen as faculty in what David called the paradigm shift in getting your colleagues to change mindsets and to be more inclusive surrounding disabilities for faculty, staff, and students?
Honestly, I think what you do is you just don't let it happen. You just, I mean, if you are so forthright as a department chair, people tend to come along. If you make it sound like this is the norm, this is not some weird situation, this is a totally normal situation, and this is how we deal with it. In my experience, I had no pushback from faculty or staff. So, I mean, again, it depends, I think, on what the nature of the various situations are. But if as a leader, you go in with, this is what we do, this is how we're doing it. It's not perfect, but we're working towards better, always. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe that sounds a little pie in the sky, but it did seem effective.
I'll add something here. I would say that, there's different gradations from lack of awareness, but potential support to outright hostility. Let's face it, a view among some in our community that having a disability is a burden that needs to be addressed, that is often seen through a more medicalized model and is stigmatized. So I think we need to one of the parts of this project we did for the pilot was a survey last fall. I know everyone is sick of surveys, but we were fortunate to work with Advance, which put together the survey similar to the survey done in Rackham for the graduate students, to really have a baseline understanding of where we are, what the needs are, and how we can improve. I would also say that, so being aware of what that spectrum is, and, you know, figuring out what are some of the pressure points where we can begin to address this kind of from hostility to lack of awareness to, you know, kind of, you know, even like clueless dismissal. So there's these different variants that are around. In addition, I would say that, you know, it is big work to, you know, academic institutions, which are premier institutions, were built on certain understandings of what productivity and intelligence are. And those understandings are often laden heavily with ableism. So how do you deconstruct the house that was built with the tools of ableism, to riff off of a, you know, kind of well-known quote? That is the challenge that faces us all. And it is a structural, institutional, ideational issue. I would say one thing we can all do is slow down. This institution runs on busyness, often a frenetic pace of productivity. COVID has been hard. It did force people, it has stressed people out. It has, people have borne those burdens and the challenges disproportionately, we know. It has to some extent slowed us down. So let's think about, just as we need to slow down to speak, so our wonderful ASL interpreters can catch a breath to to sign for us, let's slow down a bit. We're still going to be smart and interesting and get good stuff done, but I think that's part of a culture change. So, I mean, that's again a little nebulous, but you do it by doing it and modeling it. That's about the best I can do at this point, but I will continue to try.
This is Remy speaking. We have another question. So the question is there a place on campus where we can get feedback on our syllabi to ensure that it works proactively against ableism? Statements about how to access the office for services with students with disabilities is not enough, nor is a note that students can let the instructor know if they need something. Tessa.
Sorry. There are workshops at CRLT for inclusive teaching, and there are a lot of resources there. I don't know if someone there would go through a syllabus for that, but I sort of expect they would, because they do consultations about individual courses. There might be colleagues also in your unit, Ruby, who have some experience with inclusive teaching and would be happy to be collegial about doing that.
This is Remy speaking. I noticed that Carla also noted in the chat that this is a service that we would be happy to provide with the new accessibility coordinators in LSA. And I don't know, Alex, if you're able to speak more to that or not.
Well, I mean, I certainly, yes. And this is, again, some of this collective work that we can take to our new colleagues who are yet to be identified, who will be in these roles.
Tessa?
Yeah, this is Tessa. I think there was a question about a language, the language of accommodations. There are really good resources on how to write statements about inclusion that go way beyond accommodation. Asking for accommodations immediately lets out of the picture anyone who hasn't been able to afford the diagnosis and that kind of thing for accommodations. Services for students with disabilities does have some access to lower cost diagnostic services, but they can be very, very expensive. If we think not so much of accommodations, but of making statements like, if there's something I can do to improve your learning experience, please let me know. We all learn in different ways. Just telling people they're welcome in the class. The LS&A's suggested syllabus language says we will follow the law, but it's not inclusive. And for students with disabilities, it's really quite off-putting because it's just saying I will only follow the law, and that's really not enough.
And this is Remy speaking. We have several other questions. I'm going to turn to one that's specifically about work connections. So the question is, I'm struck by the notion and reality that work connections is not really proficient in dealing with faculty and patterns of work and therefore appropriate accommodations. This means that a large segment of our workforce is underserved. Can you talk through the implications of this and advocacy that we might do collectively? And I'm happy to start with, or Robin, if you want to begin, and then I can jump in.
I mean, this is actually one of the most frustrating aspects of working with work connections, and that's sort of the only avenue that really exists. I mean, I think figuring out a way to have forms that are relevant to what academics do. I mean, being asked how much you can lift. I mean, we sit at computers, you know, we do. So, I mean, I think there are ways to help work connections understand and be able to ask about academic work lives. Unless you, I mean, it's hard to change a system from the bottom. You can't just explode systems and then build something new. You have systems change while people use them. And I think working more with work connections on how they need to tailor things for academics is one step. The other step is, I think, the one that that you mentioned already, Remy, and that's centralized government, like guidance on these things, centralized places where people are able to tell the relevant units what they actually need to know. It's immensely frustrating, especially because also faculty in particular do not have supervisors in that sense. And so there really isn't any way to have someone help you actually use your whatever accommodations, to use that language, have been agreed to.
This is Remy speaking, Robin. I will just echo everything you were saying. I think centralization is the key here. And the problem that we continue to face is that we have this dispersal of disability resources and services, and it becomes increasingly impossible not only to locate what you need, but to actually be served. Work Connections also, I should note, Kate Wright-Klinsky from Work Connections was very clear about this during the September meeting of the Council for Disability Concerns. They do not handle ADA requests. They are a return to work office. And as Robin was noting during her talk, the forms are very nonsensical for a lot of cases. Like they don't quite fit if you're going through them for chronic illness concerns, for everything that was going on with COVID and return to work. The forms, literally in many cases just did not make sense. So that everybody was funneled there was very, very quizzical. But also, through work with various committees, so the Student Idea Board, which Colleen mentioned in her introduction, as well as Rackham's Graduate Students Needs Assessment Committee for Graduate Students with Disabilities, I had opportunity to talk with directors of disability services offices, as well as disability studies programs at other institutions. And often Ohio State is held up as a model or an exemplar. Theirs is a centralized office. And at the time in 2019, their director, Scott Lissner, mentioned that their ADA office had a staff of 14 people. So the key here, right, is all of these moving parts. So Work Connections exists and does its own thing. There's an ADA coordinator in OIE, which is soon to become ECRT. Accessible Technology Services, assistive technology, exists as its own entity. So mHealthy, right, ergonomics, people are funneled to different offices rather than there being a centralized avenue. The other thing that I will add here that I think becomes really important, and I think Tessa alluded to this in her talk, when you have a disability and you've never gone through this process before, you often don't know what you need. We have no avenue for consultancy here. We have no avenue for advocacy here. It is entirely bureaucratic and pathologized. So how do you know what you need is a huge question, and there's nobody here to assist you with this current framework. I want to be mindful of time, and I'm just going to check in with Dilip about whether or not we have time to take additional questions or if we are indeed at our end. We have to end, says Dilip. Okay, so thank you, everyone. I just want to thank all of our speakers. I hope we can give the Zoom equivalent of a round of applause. And I hope we have a mechanism for saving all of the questions in the chat because there's such wonderful conversation happening here.